Good evening, everyone. Kia ora koutou. It's really lovely to be here. It's always lovely to be here, and thank you for inviting us back. It feels a special honour to introduce Peter's new book to you here, because really it didn't have its origins here, but it really spent quite a considerable part of its life here, because when Peter was the writer in residence at the Michael King Centre, he was working on the book, and I know that he spoke to some of you a couple of years ago talking about the project and what he was planning to do with it. So in a way tonight it's bringing dear Oliver home to Devonport, and I hope that in the 45 minutes that Peter and I have together in conversation will give you a pretty good idea of how special this project is. It's a unique project that I think draws on Peter's enormous skills as a novelist, but his great and particular skills as an historian to bring our history to life by taking the personal and expanding it out into the particular. I just wanted, before we begin, to give you a little overview of Peter's career. Many of you know the details, but they bear rehearsing. So Peter is a writer of both fiction and non-fiction, and has also been very involved in some outstanding films. His first book, Dangerous Desires, won the Reed Fiction Award, the New Zealand Book Award, and the PEN Best New Book in Prose in 1990. Let me put my glasses on because I can't read that number. 1992. His memoir, Long Loop Home, won the 2002 Montana New Zealand Book Award for biography, and he's won many awards for his work as a film director. Many of you will also know Peter as the saviour of the Civic Theatre in the city, a great conservationist and activist for heritage. Peter and Stephanie Wells were together co-founders of the Auckland Writers' Festival. Stephanie Johnson, sorry. And in 2006, you're not married yet. In 2006, Peter was made a member of the New Zealand Order of Merit for services to literature and film. His most recent histories examined William Colenso, who was a resident of Napier, and Kiriopa Te Rau, the Paimariri follower who was hanged in Napier for murdering Reverend Karl Volkner. And Dear Oliver is the third in what Peter is referring to as his Napier trilogy, and we'll come to that later on in the talk. So in this fantastic book, Peter uses letters and his family history to explore broader Pākehā history, and we'll discuss that as we proceed. It's a very novel approach to thinking about our history, and it's extremely powerful. And I was really delighted when Peter offered to bring the book to Massey University Press. Obviously, I had not worked directly alongside Peter when I was the publisher at Random House, but Random House had been Peter's publisher. And so it's an enormous honour to bring this book to fruition. So what we're going to do tonight is we've got a little slideshow of photographs from this beautiful book, which is for sale tonight, thank you to Paradox, and I do hope that if you'd like to buy a copy afterwards, I'm sure that Peter will be very happy to sign it for you. So we're going to show some slides as a way to talk about some of the key members of Peter's family, not all of them, but some significant people. Now, what this book uniquely does is it telescopes backwards in time. So as we go along, we go further and further out in history. So that's the way we're going to track. But just first of all, I wanted to introduce to you the dear little boy Oliver, who's shown here with Peter's mother and her niece Pauline. And Peter, I just wondered if you could just quickly tell us about Oliver and the stage of life that your mother was at when this was taken.
Yes. Greetings, everyone. Thank you for having me here. This photograph is particularly interesting because my mother was 100 years old And Oliver was only a matter of months old, as you can see here. And I was very interested in the two ends of the family meeting. My mother is the very oldest person in the North family, and this funny little fellow here, the very youngest member by extrapolation of the North family. And so that's what this photograph represents, my mother meeting the other end of the family tree, this funny little sprig, you could say. Yeah. And I was somehow or another, the idea caught my imagination of trying to describe to this child what New Zealand meant and means and had meant to his ancestors, because he is his grandmother and grandparents, his grandmother and grandfather are New Zealand born. His mother is Canadian, but has New Zealand citizenship. And I was very interested in creating a kind of imaginary educational tool for this little child, giving him some sense of where we as a family, the North family, which is my mother's family, had come from. So that's what Dear Oliver is all about, is this letter that I addressed to this little boy, and which I don't imagine he'll possibly ever read. He might read it when he's an older man, but when you're young, you don't want anything to do with older people.
So Peter, just hold it there. So, just to introduce the idea that Peter had the very good fortune to come from a family that not only wrote letters but saved them. And I think, Peter, it was really a gold mine for you, wasn't it? That letters came to you as you went along. But this is an absolutely extraordinary letter that was written to Peter's grandmother when she was perhaps 5 or 6, written in 1893. Yes. And I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that letter.
It's an interesting, you can see it's an absolutely dazzlingly beautiful piece of penmanship. When Grandma was just a little girl, she and her sister became very friendly with a family friend, Mr. Mercer, his name was, and he wrote letters to the two girls, and really it was his way of trying to educate. He was obviously a very lonely man, but it was his way of trying to educate these little girls on the nature of letter writing, reciprocity, addressing a letter, sending a letter, and spelling. And this very amusing things in the letters where he mimics their incredibly bad spelling. It's very, very charming. And with this letter here, it's all about an ark that he gave them with all sorts of animals, and they set up what they thought was a circus, and they were going to charge people tuppence to come to the circus. It was a whole very charming fantasy. And this letter here is all about the circus. I don't know if I can quite read it.
No, it's a bit tricky.
You must be fastidiously careful in your daily expectations. No, I can't quite read it, but you can see it's an absolutely dazzling piece of penmanship. And his letters, not all of his letters were as absolutely magnificent as that, but they were all in coloured inks, and they were just pyrotechnic. Love letters is a wrong thing to say in this context, but very fond letters between a very lonely, I think, man living in a town where he probably came to as a migrant, and had these family friends who had very charming children. So it's a sort of Alice in Wonderland sort of situation in a way.
And this is an envelope, another of Peter's family letters written to his grandmother, who lived in Lawrence Road in Napier on Hospital Hill, or Napier Hill. Yes. And Peter, at the beginning of the book, you spent a bit of time talking about the importance of letters and how different they are to the way we communicate now, where we text or we email or we phone, and how we communicated so differently when we had the time to write, and letters seemed so incredibly important.
Yes.
Just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes. The interesting thing with our family was my grandmother stayed living in Napier as a widow and had 3 daughters, 2 of whom lived in Wellington and 1 of whom lived in Auckland. And she wrote a letter to each of the daughters every week. So she wrote 3 letters every week to the daughters. The one letter that I've got a lot of in the book is 8 pages long, full of furious gossip and information about this, that, the weather, and all sorts of things. Grandma was hugely opinionated, which is a great thing for letter writing, really. So I felt, I can remember the letters arriving, and there was a wonderful way of people staying in contact. I mean, I'm 68. In those days, in the early days of my childhood, people didn't make toll calls unless it was an emergency. Really, it was a toll call meant someone had died or there was an accident or something like that. So really, just about all information was sent, by letters, really. And the wonderful thing with letters, I think, is that they're a physical thing. You can actually look at them, like days later, and actually ponder something within them. And think, was there another meaning in what was said there? If it's a letter from a lover or a loved one, you can carry the letter around with you in your bag or purse. You can keep it as a good luck token and just carry it around with you. So the very physical nature of letters had a very special quality, which I think we've lost now with emails, which have no physical presence whatsoever. And I mean, nobody saves emails, or very few people save emails. Yeah. Is that okay?
That's lovely. So, since we've been talking about Peter's grandmother, we're just going to spend a little bit of time. So, here she is, probably in her 60s, do you think?
Yes.
Looking every bit the part of a well-to-do Napier woman.
Yes.
She looks quite formidable.
Yeah, she was very formidable.
So Peter, I wonder if I could ask you a couple of questions about Jessie, because she was formidable is the word, and there was a kind of a force around her, wasn't there? And you yourself have, I think, quite ambivalent feelings about her.
I loved her though.
Yeah. So tell me, what's interesting in the book is that you trace the course of a Pākehā family who, like many of our ancestors, came to New Zealand to do better for themselves. So, they arrived here often with not very much money, perhaps escaping poverty in London or the Highland clearances or all those things, and slowly rose through. The ones who were successful made their way through the echelons of New Zealand society, such as it was. The class, the little traces of the class system that we had. And I think your grandmother really epitomised that, didn't she?
Yeah, very much.
Can you talk a little bit about the kind of life that she was leading in the later years of her life?
Yes. The fascinating thing about Grandma really is that she was the daughter of upper servants who did after they stopped being that, they did quite well in life. So they had a farm. So they left the world of servants and became small proprietors. And I always feel with Grandma's character, that was the sort of the fracture line in her life, was this sense of ambiguity about exactly where she belonged in life, and that she admired the Hawke's Bay aristocracy, which was very much alive in the days when she was a younger woman. And she was a ferocious snob, like the most incredible snob, unbelievable snob, and it was just a completely instinctive thing with her. And part of it was her striving to be better in life. Sometimes I feel that she was almost an actor in her own life. She created herself as a Hawke's Bay lady, as you can see here, a formidable society type woman. She spent her later life playing bridge, basically, and going to bridge parties. And because she was an absolutely brilliant bridge player, she moved up through the echelons of Hawke's Bay society because she was so damned good at bridge. it's a very interesting thing. And one of the things in her life, which I think is quite poignant, was that in Auckland and Wellington, if she came up to Auckland and came and stayed with her, she went to the women's clubs. She was a member of the Lyceum Club, which some of you might remember at the very top of Smith and Coe's. It was a ladies' club. And she had the life of a lady, and was recognised as a Hawke's Bay lady. And the same in Wellington. But in Hawke's Bay, she was never accepted as a Hawke's Bay lady because it was such a small, ingrown society. People all knew that her grandparents had one time, way, way back in history, been upper, what we call upper servants. And that's the thing with the small town, and it's a rather ingrown society of Hawke's Bay. People remember everything, and they say you're not a Napierite until you've lived there for 3 generations. So, it gives you some idea of the sort of intense provincialism, which makes Napier so interesting to me. It's such a strange, interesting place. I mean, I'm an Aucklander through and through, so I look at it through the lens of someone from out of town. And I think, even though my family's been there for generations, I will always be seen as someone from out of town,
This might be actually a good moment, Peter. This photograph is you and your mother.
Yes.
When your grandmother is either leaving, arriving at what was the Mangere aerodrome? Whenuapai. Okay. So she's come in pearls and hat and gloves and fantastic.
Can you see?
Yeah, it's gorgeous.
It was in the days when you could actually walk out onto the tarmac, go right out to the plane when people got off it. I mean, it's extraordinary.
I wondered actually, while we're on the subject of Napier, if we could talk a little bit about the Napier trilogy and the 2 other books. Why, it's invidious to ask you to summarise those very, very complicated books about 2 very, very complicated incidents in our history.
Yes.
But what is the fascinating hold that Napier has? Now that you've studied it for such a long time.
Yes. I think in essence, I see Napier as an absolutely representative colonial town, of which there were hundreds of thousands of towns throughout the British Empire and other empires. I just see it as an absolutely quintessential example of what was a colonial town. I mean, it was always tiny. Even today, the population's 52 or 56,000. In the time of the Colenso book, and also the Kiriopaturo book, the population was about 2,600, I think. But it also had really furious cultural activities. It had 3 daily newspapers, when it had a population of 2,700 or something. So I just find it a really fascinating kind of thing to look at. But I'm also spurred along by my family connection to it. It gives me some extra spiritual connection to the place, where I'm really fascinated to find out, what is this place like? What was this place like? Where my ancestors lived there. And I must say, when I made a film about Art Deco Napier, which was made to stop the Art Deco buildings being destroyed in the 80s, I felt the presence of my grandparents tremendously strongly. As I walked around this town and got to know it, I felt the presence of my grandparents. I could hear their footsteps. And so I think that's another explanation. It means something to me,
You also had some fabulous statistics in the book about alcohol in Napier and the number of pubs, which was just probably only rivaled by somewhere like Hokitika. But you've got some very interesting thoughts about why people drank. And the kind of anxiety and just the damage of dislocation that immigration caused. Could you just talk a little bit about that, Peter?
Yes, I will. One of the central theses of the book is that really the colonial experience was one of immense disjunction. All these people had left everything that they knew, absolutely everything that they knew, and forever. Most of them were poor. They would never go back. They would die in a country that was essentially almost unknown to them, in which everything that they looked at reminded them that they weren't at home. And I think it brought a sort of a strange tension, I think, to their lives. I think people were always sort of, it was like their fur was always being rubbed the wrong way because they just were never really at home. And in a way, I think that their spiritual compass was very easily lost because everything was wrong. The sun rose in the wrong place, you know. And I think it was very easy for the colonial people to lose their spiritual compass and actually make really terrible decisions, which we live with today. And I think drink was this tremendous opium. It was one way that people just managed to try and cope with this situation, was really to drink to oblivion, really. And the amount of alcohol that people drank in colonial times was titanic. I mean, it was ferocious, really. And it was, you know, spirits as well. It wasn't just beer and things like that. And I think it was really, you can just say that they just drank a lot. But really, I think it was, it arose out of this sense of being ill at ease and unhappy with where they were and wanting to just forget, I think, that they just weren't ever going to be at home, you know.
I think too what's particularly interesting about Hawke's Bay and Canterbury will probably be similar is that what confounded them as well was that almost immediately the kind of class system that they thought they'd left behind sprang up, which was you know, could have sort of stopped them in their tracks in a way. We weren't going to talk about John James Northey tonight, but now that I think about him, he's a very good example of that. So this is your
grandfather's brother.
Yes, who had a roading contract to build a bridge, which went wrong, and ended up taking on the superintendent of the province of Hawke's Bay, who was an Ormond, I believe.
Yes,
is that right?
That's right. Yes.
So, you know, it was just interesting that within about 20 years of that province being built, already this class system had developed, so that in a way he was kind of having to doff his cap.
Yes.
But refusing also to kowtow to this man and the presumption of this man.
Yes, it was that sort of uneasy mixture of feeling that he ought to doff his cap, but also a sort of another feeling that really he didn't have to, and he shouldn't have to. And he was an interesting man who went on to become a shipwright in Napier, a very successful shipwright in Napier. And the thing that absolutely thrilled me, that I found out that he wrote letters to the newspaper. And I had a period in my life where I was a great letter writer to the newspaper. And I just was so thrilled to think that I had another family member who actually did this. And he actually ended up in court on a libel charge for some of the things that he wrote in letters. And I felt that was tremendously thrilling. And I thought, well, I wouldn't mind inheriting that just yet.
So Peter, we're now going to leave your grandmother and move over to your grandfather, Ernie, in North. And here he is here with your grandmother and their 3 daughters.
Yes.
In a way, he was. So this is their wedding photograph.
Yes, that's correct.
In what way was he different to your grandmother? Because he didn't seem to be surrounded by the same insecurity and snobbery.
No, he wasn't. He was one of 7 brothers. His father had established a firm, a coal and wood merchant firm, and as with many businesses in colonial New Zealand, they did everything. You know, they did a bit of everything, and they had rental properties and all sorts of things like that. But his father was loading dynamite on a hillside to get clay out for their brickyard, and he did it incorrectly, and he was essentially burned to death. And suddenly my grandfather, at a very early age, became the pater familias of the family, and took on the burden of running a family firm, in which his 7 brothers all had a role within the family firm. And he could never escape this firm. It was my grandmother's idea that, you know, his life had actually been ruined by this family firm. And of course, when you say a family firm, you have to factor in, you know, number one, the depression, and then number two, the earthquake, you know, the absolutely devastating earthquake. So as a family man, he had this enormous weight placed on his shoulders, which he accepted and never complained about. It was his understanding of that was his role in life, was to try and support his six brothers. But he did have to go through, you know, a devastating earthquake, in which really, for the Napier earthquake, the government gave very little assistance. If it was a house, you got your chimney rebuilt, and that was sort of the end of it, really. And for businesses also, it was a very miserable kind of level of government support. So he aged, my mother always said he aged enormously through the experience of the earthquake. But in a way, he was almost like a working man. He was you know, the managing director of the family firm, and he was a director of lots of other firms, but he was a sort of an old-fashioned Kiwi man, I would imagine. I never knew him. He died the year I was born.
I did just want to, that's the business in Napier, that absolutely wonderful photograph with all the horses and drags pulled up out the front. And then, this is a very heavily illustrated book, I must say, and this is just a snapshot. But I had to put in this fabulously politically incorrect advertisement, which I don't think you could run these days. No. That would have been Ern's sense of humour, I think.
It was my grandfather's sense of humour. You see that? Don't chop the old girl's wooden leg off.
Don't chop the old girl's wooden leg off. Buy some wood or coal from North, the leading wood and coal merchants. It's very good. And of course, but he became quite well-to-do.
Yes, he did.
Must have thrilled your grandmother when they became. They were obviously assisted to by a family friend, so that your mother could go to Solway after the earthquake.
Yes, that's right.
But that would have been for your grandmother a kind of an arrival with the daughter at a private school.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
One other daughter went to university, so it was all part of a kind of an upwardly mobilising family idea of a family that came from a very humble background.
So we're now going to go back quite a bit further back in time to Sydney North. And Peter, tell us what's happening here.
Yes. Sydney North was one of the very first people in Napier and New Zealand to volunteer to go to the Boer War, or the Anglo... What is it called? The Anglo...
Anglo-Boer.
Is it? Yeah.
Boer.
Yes, war. And here we have the very first people leaving town in Napier with a big drum banging and everyone gathered in the streets. And the immense sense of excitement that they had. And it seems almost incredible, really, but as with every war, they thought it would be over in a matter of months. You know, instead of which it was another long, drawn-out war where more and more and more troops had to go. But the arc of his story really goes from this tremendous excitement of going away, and then suddenly he became a celebrity because he wrote letters home to his mother, and his mother's sister husband was the mayor of Napier, and somehow the letters got leaked to a journalist, and suddenly his letters appeared in the Wellington and Napier newspapers with Trooper North's report on such and such. His letters home, another example of letters, became sort of a media, a small media sensation, really. But really, he ended sadly by deciding to go back to South Africa. He decided that he could get a better standard of living in South Africa, and he ended up in Salisbury in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, where he got sick with enteric fever and died tragically, and in a way it was a rather sad ending for someone who had been regarded as a local hero. When the troops came back from South Africa, he had the most tremendous provincial welcome. It was just incredible, with bands and people pulling the carriage that he was in, and it was sort of like sports heroes today. Really, it was a sort of an over-exuberant welcome, but then actually a very sad and almost dismal end in Rhodesia.
So I think perhaps you were thinking that we might read
Yeah.
from this point, and I wonder if you just wanted to introduce this reading, because it has to do with this. Does it have to do with this period? You'll have to remind me what our cunning plan was.
Yes, I might just do the one of Mum finding out about Oliver.
Good idea.
Is that all right?
Can I just ask you one question
Yes,
before we do that, though? Because I did want to I just wanted to talk about the fact that your family, and we'll get to this in the next generation, was a very military family in this period.
Yes.
And that some of your relatives had in fact marched off to fight Te Kooti in the New Zealand wars.
Yes.
And he was all part of this, wasn't he? This kind of bristling military, I'm up for anything.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, very much so.
That must seem mysterious to you now, does it, that impulse?
Yes. I mean, it is an interesting thing, and I do write a piece in the book where I sort of question myself and the family about, where did they stand in the whole kind of business of war in the 19th century in Britain, and were they part of a kind of confiscation of land? How responsible were they for sort of the terrible things that happened in the 19th century? And the answer I came up with was that through research I had worked out that nobody in the family had ever had any land that was confiscated. Every piece of land that they had was bought legally and through the proper channels. Yet on the other hand, you could say that they were part of a military family, there's absolutely no doubt about that. They all went along to volunteers on the weekend and had artillery practice and things like that. They were a military family. And I suppose the outcome of those wars was that my great-grandfather had the ability to become a small businessman. He got a contract to clear some of the forests, to create roads, because after this, the successful conclusion of the land wars, immediately roads were put through New Zealand to open up the landscape. My great-grandfather got a contract to clear a major area for a road, and that set him up for his whole life as a businessman in a way. So the way we relate to where we stand in these things of historical guilt and not is very, very complex and not nearly as straightforward as sometimes it's portrayed, I think.
So let's have that reading.
Yes.
Should I just pop this back in here, Peter?
Yes. So the reading I'm doing goes right back to my mother and the little boy Oliver, and it's announcing this part of the book is about introducing the idea of this child, this strange little child Oliver, coming to nature and meeting my mother for the very first time. So it's dated February 2016. Excuse me, I just blew my nose. Otherwise I'll be sniffling. Thank you. Time takes up a lot of time with Bess, establishing the time. As it's your 100th birthday this year, Mum. An appalled look on her face. Really? She looks at me. What's the date of my birthday? The 21st of April, 1916. Yes, that's right. And this is 2016. So on April the 21st, you'll be 100. She smiles a little, almost in gratification. Really? I'll have an afternoon tea for you, Mum, I say, up at the house. Don't go to any fuss. The eternal mother's code for please make a fuss. There aren't that many of us, she observes. I've asked Philippa and Suzanne, I say, my sole remaining cousins, aside from Geraldine, Oliver's grandmother, and both of them have said they'll come. Just before, she'd asked not so much who they were as where did they fit in. Your sister, Auntie Jean's 2 daughters. Where do they live? They both have apartments on Oriental Parade, I say, our posh relatives. She laughs a little, liking that. Good. And Geraldine is coming out soon for a visit from Canada. Where does Geraldine live? Conversation is like this, a kind of waltz wherein the steps go back as much as forward. Ottawa, in Canada. She is out for the summer, and I draw in a breath as if this is the slightly difficult part. Geraldine's daughter Pauline is coming too. Silence, almost a weary silence. Geraldine has 2 children, remember, Simon and Pauline. What do they do? Simon has a very good job at a university in New York, and Pauline's really good at making money. Bess likes this. She likes people who are good at making money. But the fact is, I needed to familiarise my mother with some news. This is that Pauline was visiting New Zealand with her partner Nicole, and they had brought with them the surprise package of Oliver. And it was quite likely that Pauline, Nicole and Oliver might come to Napier. There seemed an almost historic nicety in the member of the family who was oldest at 100, meeting the member of the family who was youngest, only 8 months old, sort of one end of the family tree greeting the other. When I first told Bess that Pauline had had a child, she had asked a simple question. What does her husband do? This had pretty much put an end to the conversation. Easy enough when Bess's concentration span is so reduced. But now I had to try and explain something that wasn't actually very complicated in a modern sense at all. Pauline is coming to Napier with Nicole, her partner. A lurch into silence. 2 females. I noticed her disparaging term, females, not women or even 2 friends. It was the lightly veiled homophobia of a redoubtable heterosexual who, until she had had to come to terms with 2 sons who were homosexual, forthrightly paraded her small-town prejudices. She wore them as a badge of honour. I let it lie for a second. Yes, I took up, as if nothing had been said, my tone consciously upbeat. And Pauline and Nicole have a child, a son, and they're bringing him to Napier. She thought about this. A child is good news. A son. What's his name? Oliver, I said. He's 8 months old. Poor wee chap, she said when I explained he'd come all the way from San Francisco and promptly got a stomach bug, which had then been communicated to all the relatives. I hope he doesn't have it when you meet him. No, I said. I'm sure he'll be all right by then. She sat in silence for a while, pondering it all. Oh well, we'll survive, I guess. There was in this the wisdom of a lifetime, the adjustments you had had to make to come to terms with a world arranged differently from how you might have thought. She pondered a bit further, shaking her head slightly, sighing ruefully. It's a funny old world.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we're now going to go back a little bit further into Peter's family's history, and this is a letter written to Sergeant John Northey at the barracks in Napier by his sister in London, Elizabeth Arrow, who was one of the family who didn't emigrate. She stayed in England, and she was, oh no, I think that's the Windows update thing happening. Now we get about is our technical. Would you mind just? It was time to go off about an hour before we started. We thought we'd nipped it in the bud.
It's on the laptop screen this time.
Oh, okay.
We can either agree or we can wait now.
Okay.
We'll go.
We'll be all right. All right. So she was an inveterate writer of letters to her brother in New Zealand. And Peter, when you found those letters, that must have been, because that took you right back to the 1830s, which is just extraordinary.
Yeah.
So tell us a bit about her and how she managed to escape what looked like a terrible fate for the family in Cornwall when the tin mining industry collapsed.
Yes. Elizabeth Herrera was a bit of a goer. She was tiny. She was barely 5 foot tall. She managed to get out of Cornwall, where the tin mining industry collapsed completely. In fact, the whole family left Cornwall at that point, never to return. And she managed to get herself to London. So she arrived essentially in Charles Dickens' London, that huge, steaming metropolis, and managed to find a role for herself in this city as a landlady. She had a small hotel, and for ages I couldn't work out. It was in Sheepside in London, just behind St Paul's Cathedral. And for ages I couldn't work out why there. Was it just happenstance that it was there? And then suddenly I worked out that that was where all the provincial coaches came to in London. So it made complete sense that someone would have a small hotel right there, because that was where everyone arrived. Everyone would always need a hotel. Her letters, I was shown her letters when I was really very young, and I found them absolutely fascinating. She was extremely chatty. She was a good letter writer. She wrote very unself-consciously, almost in a stream of consciousness. She described herself at one point when she was doing up the hotel for the Great Exhibition, where suddenly London was thronged with visitors. She described herself as a cat in a tripe shop, meaning she was so wildly busy and she was sort of didn't know where to go next, I think. I found, as a nascent writer, I connected with these letters enormously. So when I was really young, I found the letters meant a lot to me. I read them a lot. And my grandmother in her bedroom had this tiny little watercolour of Elizabeth. And when I was, yes, that's her. And when I was young, I used to write a diary which was addressed to her, and in letter form, where I'd write down all the things that happened to me. And so she was a really important person in my life. And in a way, I learned to become a writer through keeping a diary. That was my sort of training ground, really, was to constantly be writing. And that's the thing with being a writer. You become a writer by being a writer, by constantly writing. It's a form of exercise, just as sports people have to exercise constantly to keep their fitness up. Writers have to do the same thing. So right from being, 13, 14, I was writing these utterly insane diaries. I've still got them. They're absolutely ghastly. But it was where I trained myself as a writer, and they were all addressed to this family member. So she was a very interesting survivor in what was a very, very difficult and competitive world, Victorian London. She managed to have this little hotel. She had an alcoholic, much younger husband. She pretended she was much younger than she was, and she had an even younger husband who came from Guernsey, hence the French name. And he was such an alcoholic, she had to put him into an asylum, which, if you didn't want to send your family members to what was Bedlam, essentially, you had to pay to them to go to a private asylum, which, of course, was very expensive. So her letters are full of all these sort of nuances of the life of a Victorian landlady in London, full of spirit, really. So despite having this terrible alcoholic husband, who at one point she describes having delirium tremens, DTs, having the DTs, She managed to keep her spirit up enormously. She was a cat in a tripe shop. And I really liked the kind of spirit that came out of these letters, and it really illustrated to me the life that lives within a really good letter. A really good letter transcends time. It really does. You feel a person is speaking to you in the present, in a really good letter, I think.
Thank you, that's beautifully put. So I'm going to trip you up there. So we're almost at the end of our kind of whistle-stop tour through Peter's North family, the mighty Norths. And when you read the book, you'll see that there are many, many more of them, very colourful, truly mighty. And I guess this is the paterfamilias in New Zealand to whom Elizabeth was writing. Her brother, Sergeant John North, who came out here with the British Army to the Napier garrison during the land wars. Peter, tell us a little bit about him.
Yes. I have got letters from him, and they're painfully, I guess you would say they were almost illiterate. It's got that tremendous strain of someone who's not familiar with written language trying to write. And so he was not a good letter writer at all. But I found those letters of themselves really instructive about how people who weren't well educated tried to express themselves. And we're very used to looking at the 19th century through the letters of well-educated people who were middle class. And I felt with the book that when I came across letters from people who were poorly educated, it was actually something that was almost like a little gold mine, because you don't get that. You don't get poorer people describing their lives at all. So the letters that John North sent, they're pretty minimal, but they are very interesting. He signed up in the British Army when he was in his early 20s. He was born in 1799. Of course, it would have, when he was about 15 or 16, the Napoleonic Wars ended, and Britain was flooded with returned servicemen, and the economy just sank at that point. So it was a pretty desperate situation, with the tin mining also being up and down and all over the place, but more down than up. So he signed up to the British Army, and he seemed to have a really rather cushy life within the British Army. He seemed to, like by the time he came to Napier, he was the barrack sergeant, and that was a sort of an administrative position which was given to people who'd been in the army their whole life, who had served well and who were respected, and they were basically given a job, an indoor job, where you looked after the garrison, really. And he was the paterfamilias of the whole North family, where we all come from. I've always struggled to feel affection for him because he's so intensely patriarchal. I find him a figure that I can't empathise with particularly well. I mean, you could see from that earlier photo, it's everything about his body language says, you know, I am the father, I am the head of the family, and things like that. I don't know what else to say, really.
But it's fine if we could perhaps just a couple of words about the barracks.
Yes.
What was happening there?
Yes. The barracks were at the very top of Hospital Hill, where the hospital was in Napier. It's really one of the interesting things with the North family, that they never, ever shifted far away from where the barracks were, even right down into the 1950s. They all lived within cooey of where the barracks had been. They never shifted far away, which I think is a really interesting statement. So the barracks are up at the very top of the hill, and you can see all these buildings here made out of reeds, you know,
reeds.
yes, essentially Raupo, yes. And that was where the British regiments were headquartered. They never really did terribly much in Hawke's Bay. There weren't really major battles in Hawke's Bay on the whole. There was a one-day war, what they call the one-day war in Hawke's Bay. But it related much more to the further up the east coast where Chikoti was. So this would relate much more to the East Cape. The thing about colonial times, of course, was that there were always terrible alarms. And constantly, people in Napier were threatened with utter sort of demolition and with the Maori tribes sweeping in and killing everyone. And my great-grandmother could well remember one of those alarms where everyone was told to kind of drop everything and run. And the thing was, you had to run up Napier Hill, which is absolutely enormously steep, and try and get into the barracks if you possibly could. So I think that's an interesting illustration of the things that people lived with in those times, the sort of frightened, alarmed sensibility that they actually lived with day and night, really.
Thank you, Peter. It's time almost to wrap up and then to hand over to you all for some questions. But Peter, there was just really one last thing. You okay standing up still?
Yes, yeah.
You make a comment at the end of the book, in your afterword, about history and about Pākehā history and about the fact that we don't talk anymore about the pioneers. In your family, they were pioneers. It's not the moment for Pākehā history and hasn't been for quite a while. But you're issuing a challenge that we shouldn't have amnesia about the past. There's two peoples here, and we need to understand and interrogate both of our histories. And I think this is, this book could quite easily have been just another family memoir, but on so many levels, it's lifted so far away from that. And I think your challenge as an historian, but also a challenge to all of us just as New Zealanders to think about why we're here, what we're doing here, what the future looks like, is a kind of it's a clarion call, really. So I just wondered if I could just ask you one last question about, why is it time that Pākehā started telling their histories again? We did that a lot in the 50s and 60s, and then we stopped. Is that moment coming back, do you think?
I think it's very timely for Pākehā people to tell the stories, tell their own stories, because if we don't tell our own stories, nobody will. And that's a really important thing, that we must tell our stories, because the history of New Zealand is a complex thing, and it was a creation in its earliest stages, between two races, really, basically, Pākehā and Māori. And I think you do have to tell the Pākehā experience of history as well as the Māori experience of history to get a real sense of the reality of what it was really like. I think the end effect of the Waitangi Tribunal was that we ended up with a history of that was always about confiscation and always about what was wrong. Well, that was what the whole tribunal was set up to look into. But there is, as I say within the book, there are other stories. There are many other stories, and they're very worthwhile telling, these stories. I mean, my family are nobody important at all, but they are representative of an ordinary New Zealand family and how they experienced living here and how they had struggles and how they surmounted those struggles and how they made sense of their world. So I do think it's really important, and it's enriching for all of us to tell our stories, because that's what life is about in the end, is stories, telling stories. So that's my tuppence worth.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think you'll agree that it's been absolutely wonderful listening to Peter, and I do hope if you haven't read the book that you will. You'll be richly rewarded. We've got about 10 minutes for questions, so would anybody like to ask Peter? Just here, and then Brenda will go to you.
A couple of questions, really. I'm quite fascinated by the North with the E on the end, because I have a mother, Clark, which didn't have an E and then got an E coming to New Zealand, and a father, Westbrook, that didn't have an E and then got an E coming to New Zealand. And we kind of believe, well, we think it's because they thought that was more posh.
Yes.
So is that a similar?
I think it might be. I mean, there are various explanations. One of which is that the earlier ones were so illiterate that they said the full family name was Northey with an EY. That was the original family name. And one version might be that the earlier people were so illiterate, and they would have just, people would have said, people who could write would have said, "What's your name?" And they would have said Northey, you know, with a Cornish burr. And the people probably just wrote North E. You know, I don't know. But I always felt as a younger person it was very distinguished, that E.
But it's difficult to get people to remember to put it. You're always saying
Yes,
da-da with an E.
Yeah.
But my other question is, I seem to be the repository of those letters.
Yes, well that's wonderful.
And my uncle's school reports, and honestly,
Yes.
I don't know what to do with that.
Well, I think hold on to them, and you'll inevitably at some stage someone in your family will really want to do something with them.
Right.
And I think sometimes your role in life is to, you know, be the kaitiaki, you know, the guardian of them, and just look after them.
Yeah.
And I think someone will come along and really want to do something with them.
Thank you.
Yeah. So,
Hello. I really enjoyed that. I've learned a lot about history just from your brief.
thank you. Thanks.
I'm just wondering about your letters. Is there somewhere you would put them all on the online or?
Oh, all these letters.
Yeah.
Yes, I hadn't thought of that, really, no. I mean, I talk about them in quite detail, don't I, in the book. There's a lot of detail in the book. I did think at one point of letters all being at the back of the book, but as it turned out, the book's actually quite big anyway. So,
What about online or?
yes, that is something that you could do, definitely.
It'd be very interesting since your family goes so far.
Yes.
To see them all.
Yes, yes.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Peter, thank you for the captivating details that you have shared with us
Thank you.
today, and I assure you that I will read the book, as I've read your earlier books, and I look forward to that. And I have a question about the earthquake,
Yes.
and I'll tell you why I'm interested in the earthquake, because a fortnight after I was born, my father left my mother, not permanently, but just to go to Napier via Masterton, where he grew up,
Yes.
and to join forces with his father to go to the Napier earthquake, which happened
Does it work
a fortnight after I was born.
Yes. Was that to work on the reconstruction, or work
Well, to do what they could.
clearing away the...
Yes, I've got a family photo of a car sunk in a crack in the road, you know, that
Yes,
sort of thing.
Yes.
So the question arises out of that interest. You said that Napier didn't have a great deal of help, and I
Yes.
wonder about that, because it may be that I'm under a misunderstanding, but I always thought that the reason why Napier is such a Art Nouveau town is because the only people who are really geared up to redesign a town that had been destroyed was the government architect, and they were all crazy about Art Nouveau. And so they whipped up a plan
Yes.
in that style,
Yes.
and that's what we've got today, God bless them.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
I mean, certainly, Napier was up and running with an absolutely record time compared with Christchurch. It was up and running within a couple of years. It was staggering, really. They really did, you know... after the earthquake, there was a real question about whether it was just stupid to build a town there again. You know, why build a town on the site of an absolutely catastrophic disaster? Because, you know, it had not only the earthquake but the fire which went through town, and that's why it's still got the highest number of deaths something like that in our history. Hawke's Bay, combined Hawke's Bay. But yes, the government architects did come down and they did build really very quickly those buildings, and they were absolute state-of-the-art earthquake technology when they were built, really. So there was that sort of support, but I was just talking about support for families and businesses. Yeah.
Just in response to your question, I can recall reading that there was a local committee set up. I think one of them was a local surveyor, and they were very instrumental in the whole redevelopment of Napier and driving it along. and they researched the Art Deco, which was happening in California at the time. And so it was a small committee of local worthies who really drove the whole development of Napier.
There'd been an earthquake in Santa Barbara in California comparatively recently, and that was the thing that really made them think, let's have, you know, that kind of concrete architecture, very strong architecture. Yeah, that is right. Yes.
I was just going to comment when you said they had high-tech, the best earthquake design.
Yes.
I think the problem was that they didn't. And they put so much steel in the buildings that that's why they still exist. That they can't knock them down.
I mean, one of the local architects went and looked at the Christchurch earthquake and looked at all the buildings that were of that vintage and built in that style, and they had survived the Christchurch earthquake remarkably well, really, even that earthquake.
But too expensive to build today,
Yes.
using all that steel.
Yes,
I'm
perhaps.
guessing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Peter, does your family have any connection still with British parts of the family?
No, none at all.
No, I was just thinking, I was
Yeah.
in a thing, talking today in a group
Yes.
where all the other speakers were Maori, and I just suddenly realised that we have absolutely no connection whatsoever.
No,
you know,
I think the whole migration thing was so profound, and it was so. And I suppose a lot of people were illiterate, and therefore it was really difficult to keep in touch. But no, I think the whole migration was such a profound cutting off from that, and I think it's really common for New Zealand families to have absolutely no connection with their distant ancestors.
They're not that distant, really, are they?
No, that's right. No, that is right.
Within 4
No.
or 5 generations.
Yeah, no, that's right.
Connections,
Yes, my family is rather different to yours.
Speak up, please.
Whereas you've said that your relations came from poorer circumstances in England and better
Yes.
themselves out here. My grandmother came from a middle class family in Yorkshire with servants and living in an old rectory, which we always had a picture of at home. And there was always that sense of home was England, and she often travelled back right throughout the 20th century by ship several times with my mother in the 50s. I had travel diaries, and she was so keen to go back and play bridge with her sisters and
Yes.
visit people and all that sort of thing. So, and then last year I went to Yorkshire and looked up, family history, the Keithley Library in Yorkshire. So there's still, even though I haven't got many relations with the partner of wars and so forth, well, those people didn't have children.
Yes. It's different for everyone, I think. I do think it's different. I mean, of course, it's different for everyone.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah.
Well, look, it's been an absolute pleasure. I mean, Peter is a man of letters, if you think about it. He truly is a man of letters. He's one of his books he wrote about people with obsessions. I think someone collecting pepper pots, something like that. But, letters run right through this whole dialogue, don't they? And I'm aware of the fact that most of the letters in my own family have been destroyed. And I think a lot of us in the room here are all the poorer for that. Peter, just one side question before I finish, but what will happen to your family's letters? That's something just to... I'll get a response in a second.
Yes.
But I just want to finish off and just say what a privilege it's been to have you here. Peter said some wonderful things. I just picked up from one of his books. Language is a beautiful, treacherous, slippery veil which seduces everything. It is what defines us as human beings. And this man is living evidence of just that. We are honoured that you could share your passions, your letters, your honest appraisal, and your own relationships, in this case mainly family. you leave us with a proud legacy for the future to ponder. Thank you very much.